and sticky spots. Well, first of all, saying wooden floors, I mean, obviously the floors are wooden, like it's a tavern in a fantasy world. Like how else are you gonna describe the floors? Hello, welcome back to my channel. The video you're about to watch is a line editing video. I filmed it the other day. It was a little bit spontaneous, like I hadn't planned on doing any more edit with me videos about Project Moon. I know for the last couple edit with me videos, I've basically been doing like scene rewrites, which is slightly different than line editing. But yeah, today we're going to be looking at Project Moon, which is the fantasy book that I wrote last year. I have very complicated feelings about this manuscript at the moment. It's a low priority project for me. With all of the other book ideas that I have queued up, I don't know when I'm gonna go back to this project, but the reason I decided to make a video, like a line editing video about this, is because I thought it would make a fairly interesting discussion to look at one of the scenes, because basically I went back into the manuscript. I was reading over this one chapter in particular. In all honesty, it's one of my favorite chapters in the manuscript. I think it's for a first draft, it's not bad. And when I was reading it, I was honestly content with the overall arc of the scene. At a high level, it's not one of the chapters that needs a rewrite, but obviously it still needs work because it's a first draft. So I was hoping that it might be insightful, maybe, to talk through my mental process on this scene, because I think the writing of Project Moon in general, the writing in this book, I think it is recent enough that it's not super different from how I write first drafts now, but it's also old enough that I feel like I have fresh eyes on the work. On the surface, the scene did not change much. The events of the scene are the same, but obviously the way that we tweak individual lines, it makes a difference. It can affect the tone and the color of the scene. So much of writing in terms of my own personal experience has really been this learning process of how to dig deeper on a line level. That's what makes writing fun for me, It's that process of carving out all of the small moments in a book. They can really add up to something. Before we jump into the line editing, I'm just gonna give some quick context about the scene because it is part of a larger narrative. So Project Moon as a book has 4 narrators. This is an excerpt from chapter 3 of the book, which is in the perspective of a character named Mito Tessumi. Mito works for the Imperial Crown. Officially, he is sort of an envoy. He represents the crown in varying capacities. For plot reasons, he's kind of stuck at night in the slums of the city, and he's accompanied by someone named Aston Lambert. Aston is a member of the Prince's Guard, so he's kind of I guess he's kind of like a knight. And technically he is with Mito because he was assigned to be Mito's bodyguard for this recent voyage that they went on, but that bodyguard assignment it's more of a formality. So the real reason that Aston was assigned to go with Mito was less as a bodyguard and more as a babysitter. So in this scene, Mito, against Aston's wishes, drags them into this tavern, just kind of just to shoot the shit, just to have fun. That's all you need to know. Hopefully that's enough information to kind of understand what's going on. The excerpts that I picked out are character focused, I would say. So I didn't pick sections of the chapter that have too many plot things going on. So I'm hoping that it won't be too confusing. This video is really not about the plot or anything. So we're not going to go through the entire chapter because that would take way too freaking long. So what I did was I just took an excerpt from the start of the chapter and then an excerpt from the end of the chapter, just for the purposes of keeping this video at a reasonable length. Okay, so here's the scene. I've gone into suggestion mode on Google Docs. We'll do our rewrites underneath this scene so you can kind of see the changes a little easier. At this point, this is when the characters are walking into the bar, or the tavern, I guess. Did I call it a tavern? A blanket of heat and sweat washed over them as they entered. it was raucous tonight, every inch packed tight, with tired sailors and merchants on their breaks. A heavy-bellied man was singing and strumming a guitar out of tune atop a table. Drunkards jeered, throwing coins at his feet. Okay, let's fix this first. Okay, so let's take inventory of what we need to fix. It was raucous tonight. Okay, but you know, this is a good example of how my first drafts kind of go, more or less. Usually with first drafts, it's a lot more about getting the ideas on the page than it is about making the lines, the individual lines themselves, really pop. So a blanket of heat and sweat washed over them as they entered. I don't know if I like this of. We could say heat blanketed the tavern as they entered. The mention of the sweat makes me think that the feeling that I wanted was that it was like wet. You know, it was like so hot and humid. So wet and heavy as a damp rag. Alternatively, we could try to punch up the verbs here. Maybe instead of washed over them. I think heat washing over you is a bit predictable. I kind of want a verb that feels a little more punchy, but like something more alive. What if we said the tavern heat sizzled as they entered? Wet and heavy. I don't love the as they entered, if I'm being honest. Okay, this might be a little too much. Holding the night's pleasures in the air. Ooh, okay, you know what? Now that I think about it, I don't think this fits the tone of Project Moon. I don't think, okay, sorry. My brain at the moment, I'm currently writing another book. The tone of my current whip is like different than the tone that I was trying to achieve with this book. So I think I'm just getting my wires crossed right now. I kind of like the damp rag imagery. What do you do with the damp rag? It's wet, it's dripping. I don't want this to be a long sentence though. It's like so extra. What if we said freshly wrung? Freshly wrung of what though? Freshly wrung of the day's inhibitions. The tavern was a damp rag, freshly wrung of the day's inhibitions. You know what? I don't hate it. Let's keep going. Okay, raucous. It was raucous tonight is a very... I think this is the type of description where you don't have to say it if it's implied. I'm gonna actually move this description up first. Heavy-bellied man was singing and strumming a guitar out of tune. What is this called again? The passive voice? I feel like this should be used very intentionally. It takes you out of the action a little bit. Like it kind of slows the sentence down. He swayed atop a table with a broken lute, or armed with a broken lute. I think that kind of makes the image feel a bit more like passionate, you know? He's not just holding it, he's not just playing it. Yeah, and I think I like lute better than guitar. Guitar it sounds too modern. Lute, it might be a little bit old-fashioned for like the world building of this book, but I think we can get away with it here. Instead of saying he's singing, it could be wailing. The district that they're in is actually right on like the docks, like right on the waterfront. Wailing some awful sea shanty at the top of his lungs. You could say patrons. Heavy-bellied drunkard swayed atop a table. Where is the table? A center table. I would say they cheered. Jeered makes it sound negative. I'm actually gonna cut this out. I just don't like the way it sounds. We have to also remember whose perspective we're in. We're in Mito's perspective. The thing about writing these like atmosphere kind of descriptions is like remembering whose perspective you're in and describing the way the narrator feels as they're moving about the environment also helps kind of contribute to the immersion. Because sometimes when you're like reading a block of descriptive language, only descriptive language, unless the prose is like amazing, you're gonna start glazing over it. I think it's important to keep the character in the description. So Mito, just for context on his character, he's the type of person who's like, he's of a high social status, he's born into wealth. And so for him, coming down to these like seedier places in the city is just like a way for him to like have fun. So he finds this kind of stuff like he finds it fun, amusing. So obviously, like I said, I don't want to say it was raucous tonight because I don't think you need to. We want to paint the picture that this place is like, it's crowded in here. Mito could not see the walls or the floor. And it was just the way he liked it. Does that sound weird? Packed tight? I don't know if I like packed tight. Every inch packed? It was just the way Mito liked it. I think we can do more here. Filled to the brim. Is this a bit excessive? I kind of want just one more little description here. The tavern was a damp rag, freshly wrung of the day's inhibitions. A heavy-bellied drunkard swayed atop a center table, armed with a broken lute, wailing some awful sea shanty at the top of his lungs. It was just the way Mito liked it. Filled to the brim with tired sailors, merchants on their breaks. Oh, I guess we could bring back the sweat. Sweat and heat stagnating the air. Well, okay, never mind. Wait. We could say sweat and I want it to feel a little more like jovial. We should say laughter. Sweat and laughter, holding the walls together. Yeah, so when it comes to these, like this sort of figurative language, I think the fun part of writing is that you can just say anything is like anything, you know? But I do think that sometimes there is still sort of a logic that you have to sort of apply to your figurative language. So I chose like damp rag and filled to the brim because I think when you think of a tavern setting, you want your sort of like imagery to still fit within the world building. Let's move on. We're gonna be here forever. Oh my gosh. Okay. Mito caught sight of Aston's pinched expression as they slipped between greasy bodies, their shoes catching in sticky spots on the wooden floors. In sticky spots, I think, well, first of all, saying wooden floors, I mean, obviously the floors are wooden, like it's a tavern in a fantasy world. Like how else are you gonna describe the floors? You could say their shoes catching in spots of spilled liquor. It's like 99% of my line editing is like, is that specific enough? What if we just did this? Holding the walls together, caught in spots of spilled liquor as they slipped between greasy bodies. What else did I say here? Oh, Aston's pinched expression. Yeah, this is actually important to keep because the whole point of this is that Aston is following Mito into this tavern because he has to. He doesn't want to be there. It's technically Mito like slacking off right now. I'm gonna say Mito smiled at Aston's pinched expression. I want to do more here to kind of like point out Aston's like discomfort though. I think I'm just realizing now that I feel like I can get away with a lot more in Mito's point of view. Out of the four narrators, the four main characters, he's the one that's like most like extra, you know what I mean? I just feel like he would be very amused. I'm gonna say he looked like a courtyard statue come to life. Mito smiled at Aston's pinched expression. He looked like a courtyard statue come to life, moving his limbs for the first time, unsure what to do with himself. Yeah, I think I like that more. We're getting a little bit more out of Aston. Every chapter, every scene usually has like the external conflict being pushed forward, but then also under the surface, what progress are we making with exploring the characters? And at this chapter, which happens like at the start of the book, we're supposed to be learning on a character level the dynamic between these two characters. Because Mito and Aston aren't friends, but because Aston is essentially like the personal guard of the prince, Mito is best friends with the prince, they end up being in each other's proximity a lot, but they have very clashing personalities. And for Aston, like Mito is like, he's just like a walking problem. Like everywhere he goes, he's just causing problems. And Mito is like someone who has just had a very easy life. And so he doesn't really, he kind of does things a little bit recklessly. The way that Project Moon is actually written is that Mito and Aston's chapters are always back to back. So I think the contrast in their perspectives is really important, because in this chapter, we start to understand the character's dynamic in Mito's point of view, kind of like fun and games. But then in the next chapter, we're going to kind of see Mito from Aston's point of view. But anyways, I say all this to say that when I'm going through a line edit, I'm always trying to keep track of what every scene at its core needs to accomplish. This is taking way longer than I thought. I'm gonna go a bit quicker here. I'm gonna say, okay, so they squeezed into a vacant spot at the edge of the long bar. Aston was resigned not to have anything, but that didn't stop Mito from trying to tempt him. Okay, I'm gonna say the only open pocket in the tavern was a tight squeeze at the long bar. Actually, I think I like crowded bar better. Resigned sounds like not the right word here. Say that Aston was resigned not to drink anything makes it sound like he wants to drink something, but he is stopping himself. But he doesn't even want to be in here. Aston was determined. In Mito's point of view, the whole thing is like, he gets off a little on trying to like get under Aston's skin, not for any like malicious reasons, just because he's just that bitch. I don't know. I think we need more out of this. The only open pocket in the tavern was a tight squeeze at the end of the crowded bar. I'm gonna say Aston sat stiffly, their shoulders brushed. Actually, I'm gonna say Aston sat as he always did, stiffly. Just to punctuate it a little bit. And I think this almost sounds like, you know, in Mito's perspective, it almost sounds a little bit teasing. I'm gonna say their shoulders bumped, actually. Brushed, okay, maybe this is me doing mental gymnastics right now. I think brushed inherently has a certain intimacy to it. I think brushed sounds more tender than bumped. What is trying to be established is a certain layer of hostility that exists between them, or at least that Aston has this like wall up. That's like the whole point of Aston's character, is that he's like really hard to get to. But the section that we're gonna look at the end of this chapter, that's when we are introduced to the idea that maybe there is kind of a tenderness that exists between these two characters, but on the surface they won't ever really acknowledge it. So I don't want to bring that tenderness into this part of the scene because we want to build up to it. We want to show kind of the contrast. I'm going to say he was determined. This sounds a little vague. This might be confusing. So I'm going to say he was determined to remain perfectly sober. I'm actually going to make this a new sentence to just like stand out a little bit more, but that didn't stop Mito from trying to tempt him. I'm going to say wanting to tempt him. I'm actually going to add something here. That was, in fact, the only thing made Aston a little less insufferable. The idea that Mito could get under his skin. Actually, okay, wait, no, this is way too familiar phrasing. What if we said something lay underneath the polished, gilded armor? The only open pocket in the tavern was a tight squeeze at the end of the crowded bar. Aston sat, as he always did, stiffly, their shoulders bumped. He was determined to remain perfectly sober tonight, but that didn't stop Mito from wanting to tempt him. That was, in fact, the only thing that made Aston Lambert a little less insufferable. The idea that something lay underneath the polish of that gilded armor. It's a lot, but you know what? It's Mito and I think we can get away with it. Armor is like Aston's armor is like, it's a motif that's gonna like reoccur with his character. And you'll see it'll come back again at the end of this chapter, which we'll look at. So I actually like the idea of like introducing that motif at the start of the chapter so that we're like establishing it as like an important part of Aston's character, both physically and emotionally, you know? So then Mito says, not even a tankard of heltish ale, offered Mito, then paused and cocked his head. You are part heltish, aren't you? Or is that just presumptuous of me to say? Firstly, there are 3 verbs in one sentence here. Mito offered, paused, and cocked his head. This is an easy line edit for me. Pick one. I'm gonna say Mito cocked his head. It is fine to have this. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying most of the time you don't need to describe like every single thing. In fact, getting rid of dialogue tags is something that I do a lot in line editing, because if I can get away with not using a dialogue tag, I will. Heltish is a nationality. I think actually this dialogue I think I'm fine with. I think it's very in line with their character. Or is that just presumptuous of me to say? Most things you say are presumptuous, Aston sighed. If you drink beyond your limits, I am not carrying your limp body back to the inn. You can crawl. Oh my god. Aston. Aston sighed. This is fine. Sighing is fine. It's a great way to express a bunch of different emotions. I'm actually just going to make this a little bit more specific, because the goal here is to show that Aston is a bit irritated and that he's a bit exasperated by having to be dragged into this place, and he doesn't want to be here. What can we say here that would simultaneously express Aston's displeasure but also maybe build out the atmosphere a little bit more? I'm gonna say Aston watched the ale slosh over the rim as the bartender slid it carelessly. I'm also gonna add his lip curled. Since we use tankard here, I'm gonna take out the tankard here. Most things you say are presumptuous. Aston watched the ale slosh over the rim of its tankard as the bartender slid it carelessly across the counter. His lip curled. Mito snorted and gestured at the barkeep for another. Oh, I said barkeep? Let's say, is it heavens? I forgot what the curse word is in this. I forgot what the curse word is in this book. Is it gods? Mito would be quite amused and excited by the prospect of getting under Aston's skin here. The ale was sour, stinging. Actually, I'm gonna say the ale was shit. Throat all the way down. No, he grinned. Mito do be grinning a lot. It turned out longer than I thought it was gonna turn out. I think I like that rewrite. I don't know. I think there's a bit more character to be extracted. Did I go a little bit extra than I thought? Yes, but whatever. Yeah, these two are very fun to write. I forgot how much fun they are to write. The scene goes on. Basically what happens is Mito drinks a bit and gets into a bit of a fight with some people who are in the bar. What I'm gonna do is we're gonna move on to the second excerpt, which is essentially the last few paragraphs of the chapter. So essentially what happens is they get kicked out of the tavern. Mito is like drunk and losing consciousness. Later, as Aston dragged him out of the tavern door, Mito's knees wobbled and gave out. The heat sweltered around him, warm breeze on warm skin. He collapsed right there, cheek hitting the gravel, Aston's voice getting farther and farther away. Okay, I'm actually gonna take away this time indicator. It makes sense in the context of like the entire scene, but I am gonna change it just because maybe we can say something else. I'm gonna say, oh, pourquoi? I want Times New Roman. I'm gonna say, when the worst of it was over, Aston dragged him out of the tavern door. I think we can just say just out the tavern door by the collar of his tunic. Yeah, it's a bit aggressive, but I think I like it. The heat sweltered around him. I don't know, this sounds a bit stilted here. I think the imagery is nice, but I think less is more in this situation. Mito's knees wobbled and gave out. I think we can just say Mito's knees buckled. He collapsed right there, cheek hitting the gravel. I'm gonna say face first into the gravel. Because here, as the scene goes on, I know Mito murmured into the ground. He could taste the dirt, wet and bitter. I think if he's tasting the dirt, he would have to be like face first into the ground. When the worst of it was over, Aston dragged him out the tavern door by the collar of his tunic. The night was sweltering. Mito's knees buckled. He collapsed right there, face first into the gravel. I know, he murmured into the ground. Okay, so this exchange that happens at the end of the chapter, it was difficult to write, I remember, when I was writing this scene, because it's in Mito's perspective. You kind of have to like balance describing what is happening and making sure that the reader knows what's happening, but also Mito is drunk out of his mind. He doesn't have like full grip of reality. And here he's sort of like rambling a little bit nonsensically, but I want to make it a little clearer. So I'm gonna say before Aston could say it first. I'm just gonna say he could taste the dirt on his lips. Aston, I'm gonna say knelt at his side, because it sounds a little more to say someone is kneeling beside you, and then to say say someone is kneeling at your side, there's a bit of a tenderness to it. It is one of the few moments where there is a feeling of vulnerability in the subtext. I'm just gonna say brows furrowed. His brows were furrowed tight. Brows furrowed. I'm gonna say stop rambling. It's a bit more assertive. You know what? I think I'm gonna take this image a little bit farther because, okay, I'm getting hung up on this kneeling imagery. There's like an interesting vibe to be extracted from, you know, the trope of a knight kneeling or the trope of a knight's loyalty. Aston is very like, he takes his role very seriously. He is extremely loyal to the prince for his own reasons. That kind of like deference and loyalty doesn't really extend to anyone besides the prince. I almost feel like Mito would like see Aston kneeling at his side and kind of find a sense of like surprise. Mito had seen him kneel so many times before. Aston knelt at his side, brows furrowed. Mito had seen him kneel so many times before. Out of duty, out of deference, before Tian and the entire... Tian is the prince. Before Tian and the entire imperial court. Never like this though. Never for Mito. I feel like we should add... Mito would have laughed if... Actually, I'm gonna add... if he didn't think his ale would come up with it. Does that make sense? His stomach would come up with it. We used ale a lot in the earlier part of the chapter. Okay, now that I'm actually looking at the scene, I don't know if Mito's like, I don't know if his rambling would be clear enough in his like drunken subconscious state. He's kind of voicing a sense of like, not guilt, but like an acknowledgement that earlier in the chapter, Aston was like, if you get your ass super drunk, I'm not gonna take care of you the way I always have to. I'm not gonna like wipe your ass the way I always have to. But in this moment, that's exactly what has happened. I feel like if you read the entire chapter, that is clear. And I've had 2 beta readers on this chapter before, and I don't think they had pointed out any confusion. But now that I'm reading it back, I'm just gonna add an extra. I know I deserve it. All right, let's say Aston frowned. You always make that face. Mito rolled onto his back. The sky was so black tonight, he thought. I think we can cut that out. Aston hunched over him, and the moonlight made a bronze halo of his hair. I think I'm actually fine with this. So I think I'm just gonna keep going. Not me being fine with it. Mito felt his eyes flutter closed unbidden. We don't need to say felt. We can, or unbidden. Mito's eyes fluttered closed. Somewhere above him, he heard Aston sigh, felt his body being peeled away from the gravel up and off the ground. Now he was floating. His cheek hit something cold. Armor. Refreshing. Oh, mumbled Mito. You said you wouldn't. Okay. So, this was such a tough paragraph to write. I was having a really hard time describing this because, like, I wanted Mito to be able to like kind of distantly comprehend the fact that Aston is carrying him, but also feeling like he's a little bit caught in a dream. I'm gonna say, instead of saying somewhere above him, he heard Aston sigh. A puff of air grazed his face. Something like a sigh. He felt his body being peeled. Being peeled sounds a little stilted. Peeling away from the gravel. Peeling away from the gravel up and off the ground. I think we can just say peeling away from the gravel. I'm gonna actually put this in a line break here. So the armor comes back here, and we kind of introduced that earlier up in the chapter. So I kind of want the sentence to sort of, or the moment to kind of end on that note. I think we can make this a little longer. Peeling away from the gravel. Let's say he was flying, he was floating. I'm also gonna add the hands around him were warm. Just in case it's not clear that Aston is carrying him. I'm gonna say then his cheek hit something cold. I know the time indicator, like then, suddenly, I know it's not like always great to keep it in, but I think I like the flow of it. Okay, do I like this? Mito's eyes fluttered closed. A puff of air grazed his face, something like a sigh, before he felt his body peeling away from the gravel. He was flying, he was floating. The hands around him were warm. Then his cheek hit something cold. Armor. Oh, mumbled Mito, you said you wouldn't. Wouldn't what? Let's finish off this paragraph. Aston smelled like metal and sweat and a little bit like mint. Let's say of. Aston smelled of damp metal. Mito thought he could hear a heartbeat too, quick and steady, but maybe it was his own. Before he could chase the thought any further, the world turned black and Mito let himself get swallowed up into the night. I'm gonna make this a line break. This is a bit familiar slash whatever. I'm just gonna cut it out. Mito let himself get swallowed up into the night. This sounds stilted. Let's simplify. Let's say Mito let the night swallow him whole. I'm actually just gonna say Mito thought he could hear Aston's heartbeat too, but maybe it was his own. He let the night swallow him whole. Yeah, okay. Do I like that? Did we add that many words? I don't think we added too many words in this rewrite. 1,300. We only added 100 new words. That's not bad. Yeah, I think I like that. This was a very like tough section of the chapter to write, again, because like a lot that I wanted to balance in terms of how to depict their dynamic. There's a lot of push and pull. The concept of like writing emotional vulnerability can be very difficult sometimes. Again, they don't really consider themselves friends, but they are people who've spent a lot of time together and they actually know a lot about each other, but it's all kind of like brewing under the surface. As the book goes on, there is a romance between them. These kind of like moment-to-moment interactions between them, they take a lot of tweaking, because how obvious do you want to be? How tender do you want the scene to feel? One of my like things that I struggle with a lot is either being too vague or being too heavy-handed. For me, finding that sweet spot, it's tough. Like, I feel like I'm still trying to figure out how to do that properly, and crafting these sort of like nuanced moments is, admittedly, I do think it is an intermediate level writing skill and something that I like struggle with all the time. I hope this discussion was helpful. I don't know if it was. The thing about when I do these line edits, like in a live format where I'm like doing it for the first time on camera, I haven't really like coalesced my thoughts, and I'm not able to like explain my thought process as thoroughly as I would if I had done these edits in advance. So if anything is confusing, I'm sorry. I'm kind of just like rambling out loud, but I hope it was at least a somewhat helpful or interesting look into how I approach a line edit for a scene that is already structurally fine, and this is just the thought process that I have when I'm trying to, you know, get in the weeds. But that's it. That's the video. Thank you guys as always for watching. I hope all of your writing projects are going well, and I'll see you guys in the next one.